One of the biggest roadblocks in the way of sensible gun reform in America appears to be the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Whenever talk of gun control comes up, gun lobby groups like the NRA point to the Second Amendment as proof that the founders wanted every single American to have the right to own a gun. But like a bad game of telephone, the founders' true intentions for the Second Amendment have been misunderstood and twisted. Joining me now for more on the Second Amendment and the founders' intentions for it is Michael Waldman, president of the Brennan Center for Justice and author of the book, The Second Amendment, a Biography. Michael, welcome.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. First, I just want to congratulate you on an absolutely brilliant piece of scholarship and historical research. Could you give us a quick summary of your analysis, the history, the true history behind the Second Amendment?
Well, thanks. We call it a biography because it's really changed considerably over the years, and each generation actually decides what it thinks the Second Amendment ought to mean and ought to be. When it was originated, it was, of course, part of the Bill of Rights. It came out of the big debate over whether to ratify the Constitution, and people at that point wanted to protect and make sure that the 13 state militias, the armed forces of citizen soldiers that were so important to Americans in those days, that they were not going to be crushed by the new, potentially powerful national government. Now, those militias were very different from anything we know now, the well-regulated militia as it's described in the amendment. All adult men, eventually all adult white men, were required to be in the militia for their entire adult lives, and they were actually required by law to own a gun and keep it at home. So it was an individual right, but it was an individual right to fulfill the duty of military service. Well, as you can imagine, that was a very different time from anything we know now. It's very hard to go back in a time machine and tap James Madison on the shoulder and ask him what we're supposed to do with gun laws now. Pretty quickly after the Revolutionary period, those militias more or less vanished as a major force. And over the decades, we've had obviously a lot of guns in America and gun laws. They went side by side. Even in the Wild West, they went side by side. And we fought it out in the legislatures when Franklin Roosevelt proposed national gun laws for the first time. That was upheld by the Supreme Court, as were all the previous gun laws that were brought to the court. And that's pretty much where it stood until the 1970s. Enter the National Rifle Association. Now, the NRA, as you know, is a powerful group. It's been around since the Civil War, but it was pretty much in those days known to speak for hunters, for sportsmen. It got taken over in a fight at their annual convention, which is still known as the Revolt at Cincinnati. And the NRA changed its focus to this argument that the Second Amendment means that you should have an unlimited, unfettered right to a gun, and that anything else, any common sense gun law, is somehow trampling on this sacred American right. And they waged a very effective 30-year constitutional campaign to get that view accepted by the public and by the political leaders, and then eventually by the courts.
Yeah, and the court case, Heller, in your book you go through at some length the critiques of Heller, including by one of the guys that George W. Bush vetted for the Supreme Court, although all he asked him about apparently was whether he worked out. Can you speak to this is basically Justice Scalia's, this is a 5-4 decision, right, and Scalia was the advocate for it. Can you speak to that?
It was the first one, really, of those 5-4 decisions we're so familiar with now from this court, where it's moved to the right on issue after issue. The case was called Heller. It was 2008, and amazingly, it was the very first time that the U.S. Supreme Court ever ruled that the Second Amendment recognizes an individual right to gun ownership for self-protection. It had never done that before. In fact, it had ruled the opposite. And you're right, this was Justice Antonin Scalia. He wrote the opinion, and of course we know he is a great proponent of the approach called originalism, the idea that the only legit way to interpret any constitutional provision is to ask what the founders or the people who wrote it thought at the time, way back in, say, 1791. He said this was the high point of originalism. Well, you know, I looked at it, and others have looked at it, and felt that he really shaped his originalist historical analysis in a way that wasn't necessarily consistent with the history that I've just described. You're right that a lot of progressives kind of shrugged and said, well, what do you expect, you know, from this court? A lot of conservatives, including conservative judges, were very concerned. They had spent many years themselves arguing against what they regarded as sort of loosey-goosey constitutionalism, and they thought this was kind of like from their perspective, Roe v. Wade for conservatives, now, which they think is, of course, is a terrible thing. Right. The interesting thing is this, and this is why, even though I think the court misinterpreted what the framers were thinking about when they wrote the Second Amendment, why I don't think it is legitimately going to be an obstacle to common sense gun laws in the United States. The Supreme Court said in that case, yeah, there's an individual right, but it's a limited right. There are limits to this, just the same as there are to any other right. They didn't really go into detail about what those limits were. Dozens of courts, dozens of judges have ruled since 2008 on what this means. And with a few exceptions, overwhelmingly, they have upheld the gun laws. So it ought to be possible to have strong gun laws, real background checks, other kinds of protections to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them without falling afoul of the Second Amendment. Now, of course, the Supreme Court hasn't spoken again on this, and who knows what they'll do when they do speak again. But so far, it's more the problems in Congress, the filibuster, the cowardice of politicians, and the intensity of the NRA, rather than the Second Amendment, that's holding us back.
Yeah. In the minute and a half or so we have left, former Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens has proposed amending the Second Amendment to add the phrase, when serving in the militia. That's when your right to own a weapon shall not be infringed. Your thoughts on that?
Look, I sure respect Justice Stevens, and his dissent in the Heller case was in many ways a tour de force of historical analysis. I don't know that that particular amendment necessarily makes sense, because in fact that's kind of what the amendment already says. And we don't have militias now the way they did back then. I think that what we really need to grope toward as a society is an understanding of both a limited individual right and the kind of strong and common sense gun safety laws that can bring down that horrible homicide rate and prevent tragedies like the one we saw the other day. I think that Justice Stevens is emphatically right to point out that the kind of constitutional crusade that the NRA has waged is far from the only side on the matter. But people who have a different view, who want stronger gun laws, have no choice but to fight it out in the court of public opinion, just like the NRA did to get to where it is now.
There you go. It's an absolutely brilliant book, Michael Waldman, The Second Amendment, a biography. It was as illuminating to me as reading Patrick Henry's rant before the Virginia Ratifying Convention in June of 1788, which was absolutely shocking, you know, the whole thing about slavery. Michael Waldman, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure.
We'll be right back.